All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's web seminar on the new international requirements for exports and imports of plastic recyclables. Our webinar will start in about 3 minutes to allow everybody to get logged in. So stand by. Good afternoon and welcome to today's web seminar on new international requirements for exports and imports of plastic recyclables. This seminar is sponsored by the EPA's Sustainable Materials Management Web Academy. My name is Christina, and I'll be managing the technical aspects of today's webinar. While we wait for others to log on, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. So by now, you should have the GoToWebinar application running and should see the welcome presentation on your screen. If you're having technical difficulties using GoToWebinar, you can go to www.gotowebinar.com and click on the FAQs in the blue navigation bar on the left side of the page. The presentation slides will be advanced by the presenter, and note that a copy of the slides are also in your handout box. We really encourage you to ask questions. To do that, please use the GoToWebinar control panel and type your question in the area that says questions. Click send to submit it to the moderator. Please type your questions throughout the presentations. We will have time at the end of the webinar to answer some of the questions. After today's seminar, you will receive an email with a short evaluation. Please, please, please take a moment to fill it out. Your feedback is so vital to helping us provide the highest quality speakers and information to meet your needs. I wanted to also comment that if you're having trouble hearing or slides don't seem to be advancing or any other technical issues, generally if you just wait a few minutes or seconds rather, the problem will resolve itself. Today's seminar will be moderated by Renee Ballou from EPA Region 6, which is the South Central region. I'll now turn this over to Renee.
Thank you, Christina, and thank all of you for joining today's edition of the Sustainable Materials Management Web Academy. My name is Renee Ballou. I work in the Sustainable Materials Management Program in EPA's Region 6 Dallas office, and I had the pleasure of introducing today's webinar. I had the opportunity to work with today's speakers, and it was a unique perspective to see firsthand how plastics move globally. We're happy to have you participating. This 60-minute webinar is hosted by the EPA to provide training and a networking opportunity to state and local governments, non-governmental organizations, and other stakeholders interested in sustainable materials management. Today's webinar will describe new and significant changes to control international trade in plastic recyclables established under the Basel Convention, a treaty that governs exports and imports of primarily hazardous waste. It's a real pleasure to welcome two of EPA's international waste experts. Rick Picardi is the chief of the international branch in EPA's Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery, also known as EPA's Waste Office, and Leah Johannes is an international policy analyst who also works in EPA's Waste Office. I had the pleasure of working with both Rick and Leah on these issues, and EPA is lucky to have them. For their biographies, please check them out on the SMM Web Academy website. We will take all questions after the presentations. Please feel free to type questions throughout the webinar, and we will respond to as many as we can. So without further ado, please welcome Rick and Leah.
Thanks, Renee. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this EPA webinar, where my colleague Rick Picardi and I will be explaining some of the recent changes to the international requirements for exporting and importing plastic recyclables. My name is Leah Johannes, and I'll be covering the first half of the presentation. Some of you may be aware of the recent decision made under the Basel Convention to change the requirements for exports and imports of plastic recyclables, which we'll be referring to as scrap throughout the webinar. Because this decision brings significant changes to the way exports and imports of plastic scrap will be regulated globally, during this webinar, we'll be explaining what the new requirements are and what some of the key impacts will be on US exporters and importers. In a nutshell, starting on January 1, 2021, exports of most plastic scrap will be significantly restricted by most countries under a treaty called the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste and Their Disposal. As a result of these changes, it will become illegal under the Basel Convention for most countries to import the majority of plastic scrap from the United States. This includes major importing countries for US plastic scrap, such as India, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Thailand. Before going further, I want to provide some brief background on the Basel Convention. The convention is a legally binding treaty which establishes a prior notice and consent process for transboundary movements of wastes covered by the convention. This basically means that exports are only allowed after the proposed importing country provides written consent. And I'll talk more about what's involved in this process in a second. The treaty primarily covers hazardous waste, but also some non-hazardous waste. Currently, this includes municipal solid waste, or MSW, and incinerator ash from the combustion of MSW. The convention entered into force in 1992, and 187 countries have ratified it. The treaty's main objective is to control and ensure the environmentally sound management of primarily hazardous waste subject to transboundary movement. The US is a signatory and has participated in the convention as an observer since the beginning, but the US is not a party. As a non-party, the US has limited influence over decisions taken on the convention that may impact countries, many countries, including the US. So to reiterate, under the Basel Convention, Basel control wastes, in other words, wastes that are within the scope of the convention and are subject to its requirements, can only be exported once the exporting country receives written consent from the importing country and any transit countries. This slide provides a quick rundown of the key steps involved in the prior notice and consent process. So first, in order to export a Basel controlled waste, the exporter submits a notice to the exporting country government. In the US, EPA is the competent responsible responsible for managing the notice of consent process for waste regulated as hazardous under U.S. waste management law. And so usually in other countries, this function is also generally managed by the environmental agency or ministry. So second, the exporting country government then forwards the notice to the proposed importing country government, who then reviews the notice and either consents, objects, or conditions consent to the export and informs the exporting country government. Four, the exporting country government then informs the exporter of the decision of the proposed importing country government, and if consent is received, that generally means that the exporter has approval to export the waste for up to a year under the conditions of the consent and or the import permit. So while the U.S. is not a party to the Basel Convention, exports and imports of waste regulated as hazardous waste under the U.S. Resource Conservation Recovery Act, the U.S. Waste Management Law, is subject to the prior notice of consent process I just described, and in addition to other tracking requirements. And we'll touch more on this towards the end of the presentation. So now bringing us back to the new Basel Convention requirements for exports of plastic scrap. So in May of last year, Basel Parties decided to really require that exports of most plastic scrap be subject to the Basel Convention prior notice and consent requirements I just explained, starting on January 1, 2021. These changes are referred to as the Basel Convention Plastic Waste Amendments. Prior to these changes, plastic scrap was generally considered outside the scope of the convention and therefore not subject to Basel requirements for export. So what does this mean in terms of the big picture impact to the US? Because of a long-standing provision under the convention which prohibits trade between parties and non-parties, Basel parties will not be allowed to trade most plastic scrap with the United States, a non-party, except under a separate bilateral or multilateral agreement that meets certain Basel criteria. And now I'm going to go into a little bit of background to explain the context that led to the adoption of the amendments. The amendments were originally proposed as a way to address marine plastic litter. In the years leading up to the proposal to amend the convention to address plastic waste, many of you are probably familiar with the significant shifts in global trade flows of plastic scrap to countries where residual waste from plastic recycling was not always managed in an environmentally sound manner. And this slide provides a bit of the background in these trade flow shifts. So in 2016, China imported about half of all plastic scrap exported globally for recycling. That changed when China implemented strict import restrictions on recyclables, including plastic scrap, in 2017. Plastic that had been destined for China then started to be imported by other countries, especially in Southeast Asia. And so this graphic shows the dramatic shift in export flows between the first quarters of 2017 on the left and 2018 on the right. So China and Hong Kong in blue go from importing the largest quantities of plastic scrap to importing much lower volumes. And other Asian countries, especially Malaysia and Vietnam in yellow, start importing much more than before. And so concerns grew about the capacity of these new or major importing countries to recycle plastic in an environmentally sound manner and properly dispose of the residual waste generated from recycling. And so it's in this context and to help address these concerns that parties to the Basel Convention proposed adding export controls to transboundary movements of most plastic scrap. So from here on out, I'll be talking about what the specifics are. So the new Basel provisions classify plastic scrap into what I'm referring to as 3 different categories, establishing new listings for plastic scrap and waste in the 3 Basel Convention annexes where scrap and waste are identified and listed in the convention. So the first category covers most non-hazardous plastic scrap and waste in what's known as Basel Annex 2. This material will be subject to the Basel Convention prior notice and consent requirements. The second category covers plastic waste classified as hazardous waste under the convention. This material will also be subject to Basel requirements and is listed in Basel Annex 8. And finally, the third category covers a small subset of non-hazardous plastic scrap. This material will not be subject to Basel requirements for export, and this listing is found in Basel Annex 9. So because of the party-non-party trade prohibition I mentioned before, Basel parties will not be allowed to trade with the US in the plastic and scrap and waste falling under the first and second categories described above, except under a separate bilateral or multilateral agreement. And we'll be talking about one such multilateral agreement later in the presentation. So this slide gives an overview of some of the key changes and the new rules that will apply to exports of plastic scrap under the Basel Convention amendments. Because of how the amendments are structured in the convention, it's helpful to first describe the type of plastic scrap that is not subject to prior informed consent requirements before describing the types of plastic scrap and waste that will be subject to the requirements. So in general, exports of plastic scrap must meet a very narrow and strict set of criteria to be classified as not subject to Basel requirements under this third category. So more specifically, plastic scrap must be pre-sorted, clean, in other words, free from contamination, and be destined for environmentally sound recycling, and fall under one of four main groupings. Either one, plastic scrap almost exclusively consisting of one non-halogenated polymer. These include the most common plastic recyclables, for example, bottles and containers that are made up of polyethylene, polypropylene, PET, and also includes common or copolymer plastics such as ABS, which are commonly found in auto parts. Two, plastic scrap almost exclusively consisting of one cured resin or condensation product. An example is epoxy resins, which are commonly used in harder thermoset plastics. Three, plastic scrap almost exclusively consisting of one of a limited number of fluorinated polymers. Or four, mixed plastic scrap consisting of either polyethylene, polypropylene, and or PET, which is sent for separate recycling of each of those materials. So this category of plastics is described in a new Basel listing, B3011, in Basel Annex 9, and replaces the existing listing covering plastic scrap and waste in the convention. So as I mentioned, exports not meeting these criteria would be subject to Basel requirements and the party non-party trade prohibition. So plastic scrap and waste that doesn't meet the criteria of category 3, which I just described, would be covered under either the first or second categories I mentioned before, and it would be subject to prior notice consent requirements. So the first category covers most non-hazardous plastic scrap and waste, including plastic scrap that's contaminated, for example, with food residues and or other wastes, plastic scrap mixed with other types of scrap, like paper, metals, etc. Plastic scrap containing halogenated polymers like PVC scrap, and then all mixed plastic scrap except for the shipments that contain polyethylene, polypropylene, and PET that meet the criteria that I mentioned before in the Basel B3011 listing. And so this material is all described in the new Basel listing Y48 in Annex 2 of the convention. And then the second category covers hazardous plastic scrap and waste, which is defined as plastic waste containing or contaminated with hazardous constituents, of which there is a list in Basel Annex 1, to an extent that that waste exhibits a hazardous characteristic in Basel Annex 3. And this new listing has a waste code A3210 and is found in Basel Annex 8. So many questions remain about how the terms used in the new Basel waste listings will be defined. And on this slide, the new and undefined terms are provided in bold and in quotes. So to reiterate, to be classified as not subject to Basel requirements, plastic scrap must generally be almost exclusively of one non-halogenated polymer, resin, or one of a limited number of fluorinated polymers, be almost free from contamination and from other types of waste, and be destined for recycling in an environmentally sound manner. So some questions include, how will almost exclusively and almost free from contamination from other types of waste be defined? What will be considered contamination or contaminants? Will this include non-recyclable material like food residues, stones, and dirt, which it's our assumption that that is what that would include, but will it also include recyclable non-plastic scrap like paper, metals, etc.? And again, our assumption is yes, but it hasn't, it's not clear. And what level of contamination or mixing will be considered acceptable? And will the acceptable level of contamination differ by type of contaminant? Like I mentioned before, so these are some of the questions that we're still grappling with, and Basel parties are also still grappling with. It's expected that Basel parties will work to try to provide clarity on these terms. And EPA is participating in the Basel groups that are likely to address and try and come up with some clear definitions. So this slide helps visualize the three categories of plastic, scrap, and waste covered by the Basel amendments. You can think of the amendments as a pie with three slices, such that all three slices together cover all end-of-life plastics. So the three slices on this slide are the green rectangle on the left and the brown and orange rectangles on the right. On the left in green is the Basel B3011 listing of plastic scrap that's not subject to noticing consent, consisting primarily of clean, single, non-halogenated polymers destined for environmentally sound recycling. On the far right in orange is the Basel A3210 hazardous plastic waste listing. So plastic waste containing a hazardous constituent and a hazardous characteristic, which can be found in Basel Annexes 1 and 3 respectively. And then in brown are all plastic, scrap, and waste that isn't covered by the B3011 listing, or on the left, or the A3210 listing, the hazardous plastic waste on the right. And this again includes most mixed plastic scrap and waste, plastic scrap and waste that's contaminated, and that which contains halogenated polymers like PVC scrap. And then in the middle are some of the remaining questions about whether or how certain waste or scrap streams, plastic waste or scrap streams, may be covered by the new listings. So some questions are, will all end-of-life products consisting of different polymers be controlled? For example, auto parts made up of polycarbonate and ABS plastic. And how about scrap containing some contamination, for example, PET bottles with their labels or containing some food residues? And then what about end-of-life products containing some plastic, but that consists predominantly of non-plastic material? So for example, office furniture, like those hard plastic chairs that are made up of plastic, but then also have steel in the legs and that kind of thing. So that's basically an overview of the Basel Plastic, Scrap, and Waste Amendments, the requirements that apply, and a highlight of some of the key questions that remain about the types of material that may or may not fall within the scope of the new provisions. I'll turn it over now to Rick to talk through the new international requirements that apply to transboundary movements of plastic, scrap, and waste under another international agreement that governs the export and import of primarily hazardous waste for recovery. So with that, we will be having a transition where we change slides.
So Rick, if you will please put your slides up, then we can hear your presentation.
Okay, so I clicked show my screen, which worked before, but the slide didn't come up this time.
So we are currently looking at connected to GoToWebinar.
Oh, here we go.
Beautiful.
Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, there's two major international agreements that control the imports and exports of waste. And Leah just talked about the first one, which is the Basel Convention. There's another one that is between countries that are members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. And that's basically a consortium of the governments of 36 affluent or relatively affluent developed countries. And in 1992, they put a legally binding agreement in place, which is called the OECD Council decision. And the idea was, at the time, was to have a consistent import-export approach for shipments for recycling and recovery among the OECD member countries. And so that agreement is still in place. And even though you have Basel, the OECD Council decision allows for a more streamlined procedure. So the OECD countries like it and retained it even though Basel exists. So one of the nice things about the OECD Council decision, it allows us to trade in Basel covered waste with OECD countries. Basel Convention's got a what's called a party non-party prohibition. There's a prohibition between that Basel parties and non-Basel non-parties such as the US are not allowed to import and export with each other unless there is a certain kind of agreement, which is covered in Article 11 of the Basel Convention. They're just called Article 11 agreements for short, of which the OECD Council decision is. And so that allows us to trade, and we have quite a bit of scrap trade with the OECD countries. And the OECD countries are Europe, Canada, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, Australia, countries like that. So as you can see, we've got, last year we had, just looking at plastic scrap, which is one of the many types of scrap the OECD countries trade, we have almost 600,000 metric tons of trade. It's valued at almost $300 million, and it represents over half of US plastic scrap trade. Understandably, Mexico and Canada are very close, and so historically they have been major trading partners for us on a wide variety of scrap, including plastic scrap. So one of the things the OECD countries did, so during the 1990s, a lot of the OECD member countries ratified the Basel Convention. They became members, they became parties of the Basel Convention, and by ratifying it, become a party, they said, we're going to implement the Basel requirements. And so those countries had two sets of import-export requirements then, the Basel requirements and the OECD requirements. And while they were similar, they weren't the same. And so in 2001, we revised the OECD Council decision to harmonize it with Basel. And one of the ways it was harmonized was the waste lists. Leah had talked about 3 different waste lists in Basel, Annex 2, Annex 8, and Annex 9. OECD's got 2 lists, amber and green, hazardous and non-hazardous. And so basically the OECD countries agreed in 2001 that any changes to the Basel waste listings would be automatically incorporated into the OECD waste listings unless a country objected. There's been a number of waste listings since 2001. No one's ever objected. Folks were okay with the Basel waste listing changes going into the OECD amber and green scrap list, waste lists. However, the US did not think that the plastic scrap waste listing changes in Basel should be incorporated into the OECD. Partly why a major reason the waste listing changes were made in Basel is there was some concern about after plastic is recycled, there's always residual waste or residual plastic, and it can be difficult to recycle, and that too often that was getting dumped and was ending up in streams, creeks, and rivers, and eventually the ocean. And so there was some attempt through Basel to try and get at the marine litter issue through those waste listing changes. But the thing is, that may apply to developing countries, but it doesn't apply to more affluent countries, which are much better at managing the residual waste that you have after recycling, where it's frequently landfilled in a sanitary, well-engineered landfill. So we did not support the automatic incorporation of the plastic scrap listing changes in Basel into the OECD. And so our concern was that it's going to create extra steps. It's going to make imports and exports of plastic scrap a little more expensive, and it's going to decrease recycling among countries where we want to make it as easy as possible for plastic scrap to move and keep recycling levels as high as we can. So because we objected, that triggered negotiations within the OECD to come up with an alternative approach. So if we weren't going to automatically incorporate the Basel waste listing changes into the OECD, what was going to be the approach that we were going to use instead? And so a negotiation process, a special negotiation group was established last July 2019, and it was able to reach agreement on hazardous plastic scrap, but unfortunately not on non-hazardous plastic scrap. So basically, hazardous plastic scrap, and we think that hazardous plastic scrap is really a small sliver of plastic scrap. But the agreement is that it would be subject to prior notice and consent in the OECD. And basically the way hazardous plastic scrap is defined in the OECD is you've got an appendix in the OECD in Appendix 1, which is a list of hazardous constituents. And then you've also got an Appendix 2, which is a list of hazardous characteristics. For those of you who are familiar with RCRA, we've got the toxicity characteristic, reactive, corrosive, that kind of thing. So Basel and OECD's got those characteristics and more. And so if you contain a hazardous constituent from Appendix 1 and you exhibit a hazardous characteristics from Appendix 2, then you're hazardous plastic under OECD. So we're able to reach agreement on that. That change we made to the OECD Council decision. Non-hazardous plastic scrap, which of course is a much higher percentage of plastic scrap, the countries could not reach agreement on. There were some OECD countries that wanted to, while they wouldn't take the Basel plastic scrap changes verbatim, they wanted to take something very similar, which we and some other countries thought didn't really make sense. And unfortunately, the OECD countries were just too far apart to really reach agreement on hazardous plastic scrap. And as a result, I think different countries within the OECD are going to apply different controls to they're going to apply different controls to the plastic scrap. So so there's quite a bit of uncertainty about what requirements the OECD countries are going to apply. Some of the countries are going to apply prior notice of consent for non-hazardous plastic scrap. We've got some other countries who are saying that plastic scrap, because we could not reach agreement in the OECD on an OECD-wide approach, that plastic scrap is just outside the scope of the Council decision. It doesn't cover it. And if it doesn't cover it, then Basel Convention covers it. Well, that gets back to that party non-party prohibition in Basel that I had mentioned earlier. And since almost all the other countries in the world are Basel parties, if a country in the OECD, even though we have the OECD Council decision and it's an Article 11 agreement, still if they say it's out of scope, then they're saying they're not going to trade plastic scrap with us. Now, the countries in the OECD have been asked to tell the OECD organizations, called a secretariat, which interpretation they're going to use. Are they going to use out of scope? Are they going to say that the OECD Council decision covers it and they're still willing to trade without notice and consent? Or are they going to say the Council decision covers plastic scrap, but we're going to require notice and consent? So there's different approaches countries can take. And the countries have not reported yet. They need to report by December. One of the things we pushed for, the US pushed for, was to get something called a review clause in the OECD Council decision, basically saying, okay, we're going to try this approach for a while where countries are taking different approaches, and that may or may not work very well. So let's revisit this at some point and decide whether we want to try and negotiate a common OECD-wide approach to how to handle plastic scrap in the future. So that's something that we agreed to do in 2024 after countries have some experience with the current approach. So plastic scrap, currently plastic scrap and waste could be regulated as hazardous waste under the U.S. Waste Management Law, which is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Now, again, I mean, not much is really. I mean, an example where you might have it is sometimes lead is used as a stabilizer in plastic, and it's possible if there's enough lead, maybe it could fail the toxicity characteristic and potentially be hazardous plastic scrap. But you know, again, we think that's a very small percentage. But if you were a hazardous plastic scrap, there's certain requirements that the U.S. would apply and EPA would apply, and that's prior notice and consent for importing and transit countries. So there's some tracking requirements, and then the receiving facility would have to send a confirmation of receipt when they got the shipment and a confirmation of recovery when they recycled the material. So again, the majority is not subject to RCRA because we don't think it would be hazardous. But one of the things I think is the world is changing. We see more countries considering a wider variety of plastics as hazardous. I think historically, I think the vast majority of countries have seen plastic scrap as not hazardous. But we've got countries that have told us that if plastics have brominated flame retardants or things like that, or lead or cadmium, you know, they might start considering them hazardous. So that's something that can impact us, that even if we don't consider this, if we're importing and exporting with those countries and they're applying requirements, that affects, that's going to affect the U.S. imports and exports. So the U.S. exports are subject to applicable laws and regulations in importing and transit countries, which is basically, you know, what I just said is that it's not only how we see them, you know, imports and exports always involve, you know, at least two countries, if not more. You've got countries that a shipment might transit through, and so it can involve 3, 4, 5 countries. And so those countries might regulate plastic scraps in different ways. And so you have to be cognizant of their requirements too, anytime you're involved in an import or export. So we think, so obviously when China significantly restricted a wide variety of scrap, the imports of a wide variety of scrap, including plastic scrap, that had a significant impact on plastic scrap trade. Now we think the Basel requirements, which go into January 1st, and the OECD changes also go into effect January 1st because they're aligned with Basel, that's also going to have significant impacts, more so for the U.S. probably than any other country. So it's going to effectively stop trade in plastic scraps for those countries that aren't OECD countries and are Basel parties because of the Basel Party non-party prohibition on exports. It's also going to affect on some OECD countries if, like I mentioned earlier, if they take an out of scope interpretation and they say the OECD Council decision doesn't apply to plastic scrap movements and Basel applies instead. So as you can see for the export chart, we've got significant exports to countries like India, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. These are all countries that are Basel parties and they're not OECD members. So I think, you know, we're going to see some significant impacts on exports to those countries. So we export, you know, almost 700,000 metric tons of plastic, and it's worth almost $300 million. And last year we imported about almost 400,000 tons, valued at $226 million. And as you can see on the imports, a lot of our imports are coming from Mexico and Canada. We have a fair amount of imports and exports with Canada, but with Mexico, we're importing almost 4 times as much plastic scrap to them as we're exporting. And they make up, as you can see, about 3/4 of our imports. So they're important, particularly important for us when it comes to imports. So we're going to see a number of impacts. You know, there's some dramatic changes here. We think there's going to be a lot of confusion in the regulatory community, both in a technical sense in terms of what plastic scrap is going to be covered and how is it going to be covered, and what are the procedural requirements. There's the prior notice and consent process and the tracking, and the, you know, the certificate of receipt and the certificate of recovery. You have all these, you know, procedures, because we're talking about the plastic scrap community is a community that has not had to do these kind of things in the past. Those who are shipping hazardous waste and those who are shipping hazardous scrap have been doing this for decades, but not the plastic scrap community. It's brand new to a lot of folks here. So I think there's going to be some real challenges and some real growing pains initially. We're also going to receive notification, you know, we're going to receive export notices from other countries that want to send plastic scrap to us, and we don't regulate the plastic scrap and we don't require a notice, but that country is going to require a notice, and so they're going to send it to us. So EPA is going to start getting plastic scrap notices that we've never received before. And so what we'll do is, since we don't regulate it, we don't consent, we do something called neither consent nor object, which is effectively a consent. And that's what we'll do, but that's going to be a change as well. And so that's something that we're going to need to respond to. So I think there's going to be significant effect on US recycling programs. I think, as some of you know, China paid really pretty well for plastic scrap, and that was a real benefit, a real good revenue source for some US recycling programs. Some of the other Asian countries don't pay quite as well as China, but still pay relatively well. And so we're probably going to lose a fair amount of those markets, which means that the revenue we're getting from our plastic scrap is probably going to decrease. And so that's going to put pressure on us in the sense that you're probably going to see plastic scrap recycling decreasing, and we're probably, at least in the near term and maybe midterm, in most places, see an increase in a landfilling of plastic scrap. We know that in some areas of the country, they're working to increase their recycling infrastructure, and so that's happening. Maybe that'll grow to other countries, other parts of the country, but right now that's sort of seems like a subset of countries. It seems like most parts of the countries more are shifting towards away from recycling towards more landfilling. So before I go into these resources, just let me say in conclusion that, you know, I think the main message here is that we're going to see dramatic change starting on January 1st. We're going to have a number of countries that are going to view U.S. plastic scrap exports as illegal traffic from their perspective. You're going to have a number, you know, even when plastic scrap can still be imported and exported, you're going to have notice and consent requirements that you didn't have before. So there's going to be a dramatic change next year in how plastic scrap imports and exports work. That's going to affect a lot of players. It's going to affect a lot of people and a lot of companies, and a lot of government agencies, for that matter, who are going to be receiving notices and need to process them when they didn't have to do that before. So some of the resources that are available through these links is an explanation of the Basel plastic scrap amendments, the waste listing changes. They're not necessarily intuitive if you haven't worked in the Basel world, so I think this is a good explanation of those changes. There's the U.S. RCRA hazardous waste import-export requirements, which I talked about briefly before. There's information on that. And then there's some of the link to our international agreements for transboundary movements, imports and exports. And I think there you can find the OECD Council decision if you want to see it. And those are EPA resources. There's some Basel links. One of them is, if you want to read the Basel plastic scrap amendments themselves, plastic scrap and waste amendments, go to that first link. And then if you want to get information on, if you want to see the Basel Treaty or get information on the treaty, just go to that next slide. And that is it for me. I want to thank everybody for joining this, and we're going to go into questions at this point.
All right, thank you, Rick and Leah. So we have had quite a few questions coming in throughout both of your presentations. So we will try to get as many as we can with the amount of time that we have left. So this, I think we had a couple of similar questions. So we're going to start off with this one. What do U.S. exporters and importers need to do to comply with these new changes? And what do you recommend U.S. scrap plastic exporters do to prepare for these new regulations?
So that's a good question. I think this is probably something Leah and I could both respond to. I would say one of the things is we are going to do another webinar in a couple of months that's going to be focused towards importers and exporters, where we're going to talk more about the procedures, the forms, the kind of information that needs to be applied, you know, that kind of thing. And so I think that's something that will be very helpful. This presentation is a little more general because I think it's more suitable for this audience, but that webinar will really be more geared towards the folks that have to implement those changes. We've also put some information up on our webpage that specifically talks about some of these changes and provides more information. It's something that Leah put together, and that link is the bottom of the page here. So you can go there for more information on what you need to do. But Leah, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's those are the best places to look for the information. I think we've both emphasized that I think one of the most important things to do would be familiarize yourself with the new provisions, and you can find the links to those both on our EPA webpage and on the Basel website. And then it is, like Rick said, going to be up to countries to interpret the provisions and determine how they're going to be implementing them at the national level. And so wherever it is that you do business, if you're a company, an exporter or an importer, your best bet is to familiarize yourself with the requirements that will be imposed by the countries that are involved in those transboundary movements. And then, yeah, recognize that because of our non-party status, I think there will be an increased level of scrutiny for shipments coming from the U.S. or, yeah, especially on the export side. And the webinar that Rick mentioned will be later in November, so stay tuned for that. We'll be updating our webpage with that information.
All right, thank you. So Leah, I think this went along with your presentation, but the next question is, what is the definition of environmentally sound recycling? And do the Basel amendments already include a definition of what is and what is not considered recycling?
So that's a really good question. In the amendments themselves, so the Basel Convention has a definition about what is environmentally sound management, and generally the concept is management that is protective of human health, environment. With respect to these listings themselves, there is no definition of what makes a recycling method environmentally sound, and so that's one of the ambiguities that remains, and I think where there needs some more work to be done to provide that clarity. I think in general, in the Basel Convention itself, there are a number of recovery operations, and the plastic that moves under the B3011, which is the material that's not subject to notice of consent, is limited to one of our operations, which is generally meant for mechanical recycling or recycling of organic substances. And so that's sort of the definition, that's the framing that's put in the actual listing. But again, there is no definition of environmentally sound recycling. I mean, Rick, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, it's one of our frustrations. So one of the things that happened with the Basel plastic scrap changes was normally these kind of changes occur over a series of meetings over a couple of years, even 2 or 3 years. And so a lot of times these terms are usually defined by the time the change is made. And if they're not all defined, most of them have been defined. And so people have a fairly good understanding. The Basel countries were so concerned about marine litter that they just sort of drove through this change at the meeting, the Basel meeting in May 2019, all in one meeting. And so that's left in this unfortunate situation where there are a number of terms that are not well defined at this point. And the Basel, I think some Basel group probably will define them, but I think it's going to take, unfortunately, a considerable amount of time. And so I think what we're going to have is countries are going to take their best stab at it, but that doesn't make for a very necessarily a consistent approach. So I think there's going to be a number of bumps in the road, probably these next couple of years, until many of these terms are better defined.
Thank you. So our next question refers to e-waste plastic. So one of the questions is, where does e-waste plastic fall in these 3 categories, both with or without flame retardants?
So that's a really good question. And I think our best guess, so I think the person who's asking the question is probably caught on to the fact that non-halogenated polymers is one of the key terms in the, let's call quote unquote exempt plastics. And so if you're non-halogenated, you're not subject to notice consent, but you could then be subject to either the non-hazardous listing that is controlled under the convention or the hazardous listing. And at that point, I think it's really up to determining whether or not there's a hazardous characteristic that's exhibited by the waste. I think that a lot of, when we talk to countries in the OECD process, when we were doing those negotiations, a lot of countries mentioned brominated flame retardants and flame retardants as the types of plastic that they would that they were thinking would be covered under the hazardous plastic waste listing. So I think that's sort of what we're anticipating. But I think it will be up to individual countries to be making that call. Under the Basel Convention, which is unlike RCRA, for the folks that are familiar with RCRA, there's a presumption of hazardousness when you're on a waste listing, and you use the characteristics to sort of get out of that characterization. And so I think we will be seeing, importers and exporters having to demonstrate whether or not their material is or isn't considered hazardous under different countries, legislative regulatory frameworks. Rick, I don't know if you have anything to add there, but I think the hazardous plastic waste listing is sort of where we're anticipating those plastics to fall.
Yeah, no, that was good. I don't have anything to add to that.
Thanks, Leah. I think your answer actually also responded to a couple other questions as well, so that was very helpful. So we're receiving quite a few questions about different countries that are either members to the Basel Convention or who is included in the OECD countries, including some questions about the US involvement. So I guess the best way to phrase these 2 questions is, first, Rick and Leah, are there places where there's lists of OECD countries and the Basel Party countries. If you could let the audience know where people who are looking to see who else is involved, where they can find this. And then as a follow-up, we talked about earlier how the US is a signatory but not a party to the Basel Convention. Could you explain why that is and why the US is not yet a party to the Basel Convention?
Yeah, I would say on the first question, I think if you go to OECD.org, you can get a list of the OECD member countries. And then in the resources, we have the Basel Convention link, which I believe has a list of the 187 Basel parties. The list is probably not the easiest to find, but it's in there, so you can find it. In terms of ratifying the Basel Convention, so basically there's a set of requirements that are in Basel, which if countries ratify, they need to be able to implement those requirements. And the US has the legal authority to implement many of those requirements, but there is a few that we don't have the legal authority for. So we've got some legislative gaps, and they're basically in three areas. One is if something's a Basel covered waste, then we need to be able to require notice and consent, et cetera, some of the other requirements for import and export. It's only import and export would result in no change to how those scrap or waste would be regulated domestically or not regulated, as the case may be. An example I use there is medical waste. We don't regulate medical waste at the federal level, but a lot of other countries do. And so, we would need to be able to require prior notice and consent for imports and exports of medical waste, but how we regulated medical waste domestically would not change at all. Another area is requiring returns of waste. Sometimes, there was a mix-up, or you had a bad actor and they sent some waste that shouldn't have been sent. EPA would have to have the authority to sort of force the return of that waste, or more typically just alternative management in another country that can manage it in an environmentally sound manner. And the third area where we've got a gap is I talked a little bit about transit countries. You got the exporting country and the importing country, and sometimes waste or scrap will go through another country and you need a transit notice for those countries. Anytime in Basel, anytime waste goes through another country, you should send a transit notice to that country and get their approval, get their consent. And that is not normally an issue for us. We have transit notice requirements in the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act for imports and exports, but it's only for imports and exports, and that's an issue because of Alaska. So if you've got hazardous waste being trucked from Alaska, it's going through Canada to the lower 48, it's neither an import nor an export. So we don't have authority under RCRA to require a transit notice, but Basel requires a transit notice anytime you have waste going through another country, and in this case, Canada. So, so those are the three areas where we need legislation to fill those gaps, so then we have all the legal authority we need, and then we could ratify the Basel Convention.
Great, thanks, Rick. Thanks for that thorough explanation. So I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So Leah, you spent a lot of time talking about contamination. So is there an acceptable level of contamination, or sorry, let me rephrase that. Is the acceptable level of contamination dependent on the intended goal of the recycled plastics? And when we talk about different types of contamination, does this also include labels? I know you mentioned food as one of the types of contamination.
Yeah, so this is a great question. And again, one of these terms that has not been clarified yet under the Basel Convention due to, the quick pace of negotiations to come up with these listings, as Rick mentioned. So, what does contamination mean? What does almost free from contamination mean? Are all terms to be defined. But I guess, one thing in the listings themselves, there's a reference to specifications. So this could be industry, internationally used industry specifications, or national specifications as a point of reference for some of these terms, like contamination. And so I think that there will be, some examination of what specifications exist out there to get a sense of where countries may end up, interpreting and implementing different contamination thresholds. But the short answer is we don't know. And does it depend on what the destination, or how the materials intended to be managed, or what the recycling practice might be in the importing country? Another great question, and we just don't know.
Great, thanks, Leah. So I know a lot of people did submit questions, so I want to apologize if we weren't able to get to your question today. We are limited on time, and everyone's very curious about this. So I want to apologize if we weren't able to get to your question today, but that's all we have time for. So right now I'm going to turn it back over to Christina. Thanks.
Thank you, Crystal. You guys really had some great questions, and I wish to thank you for sending those in. I really wish to thank my colleagues and today's speakers and moderators for their insights on the new international controls that will soon apply to global exports and imports of plastic scrap and waste. And finally, most of all, I really want to thank you guys for joining this SMM Web Academy, and I hope you continue to join us for future webinars. It's you that this program is designed for, so make sure you complete our evaluation and give us feedback on how we can better meet your needs. We will post the webinar evaluation and the slides and the audio in about 2 weeks. About an hour after this webinar, you will receive an email that contains that location along with the survey. The survey will not be posted, so you do need to fill that out when you get it, and we so appreciate that. Please join us for the next SMM Web Academy webinar. It will be on the National Recycling Strategy, which will be coming soon. We don't have a date for it, but it will be coming in early October. Thank you, everyone, and this concludes today's EPA SMM Web Academy session. Thank you, and have a fabulous day.